70,000. That's exactly how many locomotives this company built over its history. At the peak of their power, they rolled a new steam engine onto the rails every 14 hours. For a whole century, they literally created the physical traction that drove the industrialization of the entire world forward. Baldwin Locomotive Works wasn't just a factory. It was the Vatican of heavy engineering. Their giant complex in Eddystone spanned 600 acres of land, where 18,000 people toiled. They created fire-breathing metal leviathans that embodied absolute power. Railroad tycoons lined up for them. Baldwin was synonymous with the word train. But by 1956, the fires in the Eddystone furnaces were extinguished forever. An empire that survived wars and the Great Depression was wiped off the face of the earth in just a decade. Today, faceless office parks stand where the workshops used to be. How did a company with the best engineers sign its own death warrant by refusing to look at the calendar? This isn't just a story about technological lag. It's a story about how a blind love for the aesthetics of a passing era and corporate hubris killed the greatest giant of industrial America. Part 1. Origins. To fully grasp the scale of this industrial tragedy, we need to rewind time back to an era when America was not yet entangled in a steel web of railroads, the 1830s. The world moved at the speed of a horse's gallop or a river's current, and in the center of this unhurried, patriarchal reality, a man appears whose name would soon become synonymous with untamed kinetic energy. His name was Matthias William Baldwin. Paradoxically, the father of America's heaviest, most massive, and loudest machines began his career with the finest, quietest, and most delicate craft. Baldwin was a Philadelphia jeweler. He sat for hours with a loupe in his eye, assembling tiny clockworks, polishing silver, and fitting microscopic gears together. His workshop smelled of fine machine oil and polishing paste. He was a man obsessed with micrometers and absolute mathematical precision. In 1831, the leadership of the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia approached this jeweler with an unusual request. The first steam locomotives had already begun to appear in England, and the American public wanted to understand what they were. Baldwin was asked to build a miniature working model of a steam locomotive for a museum exhibition. Baldwin agreed. He applied his jeweler's approach to a miniature boiler and cylinders. The model worked so flawlessly, running on circular tracks in the museum hall, that it caught the attention of the management of a newly formed local railroad, the Philadelphia, Germantown, and Norristown Railroad. They asked Baldwin a fateful question. "Mr. Baldwin, could you build a machine like this, only full-sized? A real one?" Baldwin, who had never built anything larger than a grandfather clock, answered, "Yes." In 1832, Old Ironsides rolled out of his workshop. It was a 5-ton leviathan of iron, copper, and wood. By modern standards, it looked like a toy, but to the people of that time, it was a fire-breathing dragon. It reached an incredible speed of 28 miles per hour. On the day of its maiden voyage, people scattered from the tracks in terror, thinking the end of the world had come. Baldwin applied the same philosophy to this giant as he did to watches. Phenomenal, manic precision in fitting the parts. In an era when most mechanisms were assembled by eye and with a sledgehammer, the cylinders of Baldwin's locomotive were machined to perfect smoothness. The success of Old Ironsides was so deafening that Baldwin abandoned the jewelry business forever. He founded a factory on Broad Street, right in the center of Philadelphia. Soon, the name Baldwin became a mark of the highest quality, like a hallmark on gold. But from the very beginning, from the very first days, Baldwin embedded an ideology into the DNA of his company that made them great, and 100 years later, killed them. It was the ideology of custom manufacturing, bespoke tailoring. Baldwin didn't make standard locomotives. A customer would come to him and say, "I have a railroad in the Appalachians. It has sharp turns, heavy grades, and the coal we mine is very wet and burns poorly." And Baldwin's engineers would design a unique locomotive with a unique firebox, a unique wheelbase, and a unique boiler specifically for that one railroad. Baldwin Locomotive Works became an engineering boutique on a gigantic scale, a place where the highest, unrepeatable craftsmanship of individual engineers was paramount, not assembly line standardization. This was their point of pride. This was their religion. Part 2. The Ascent. A true tectonic shift in the company's fate occurred in the 1860s. The American Civil War tore the country apart, but it also became the greatest catalyst for industrial progress. It was the first war in human history where logistics, the speed of moving troops and supplies, decided the outcome of battles more than the courage of soldiers. General Ulysses S. Grant needed trains. Lots of trains. Baldwin Locomotive Works transformed from a simply successful factory into a national strategic giant. They became the main logistics arsenal for the Union Army. The factories in Philadelphia worked day and night. The sky over the city was permanently black with coal smoke. It was during the Civil War that the most important conceptual innovation of the time was introduced and perfected within Baldwin's walls: standardization and complete interchangeability of consumable parts within a single series of custom locomotives. Before this, if a locomotive broke a connecting rod out in the prairies, you had to call a blacksmith who would spend weeks forging and fitting a new part by hand, right on the spot. Baldwin introduced a system of templates and gauges. Now, if a locomotive broke down somewhere in Ohio or Tennessee, the engineer could send a telegram to Philadelphia with the part number. The part was shipped on the next train, and a mechanic in the field could simply install it, knowing it would fit down to a fraction of a millimeter. This was a revolution in maintenance that cemented their reputation. After the Civil War ended, as the country began to rebuild and westward expansion became a national idea, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, a truly golden age of railroad construction arrived. The Broad Street plant grew to monstrous proportions. It swallowed several city blocks in the very heart of Philadelphia. Thousands of workers flocked to the gates every morning like an army of ants. The roar of steam hammers shook the foundations of neighboring residential buildings. The city lived to the rhythm of this factory. Baldwin ceased to be just an American company. They became a global empire. Their locomotives began to conquer the planet. When the Russian Empire began building the grandiose Trans-Siberian Railway, the heaviest and most reliable locomotives for the harsh Siberian winters were ordered from Baldwin. When Japan began its rapid modernization, the Meiji Restoration, the first trains on their islands bore a plate reading, "Made in Philadelphia." South America, Africa, Europe, Baldwin's fire-breathing machines pulled freight on every continent. They became the main and most prestigious export product of United States heavy industry. But along with money and fame grew something less tangible, but far more dangerous: A unique, almost cult-like culture of loyalty was built inside the company. Workers and engineers sincerely believed they were creating the most complex, most perfect moving mechanisms on planet Earth. And they were right. The steam locomotive of that time was the pinnacle of human genius, a highly complex symphony of thermodynamics, metallurgy, and mechanics. The management of the company was passed down not to random Wall Street managers, but from partner to partner, from engineer to engineer. They created a closed caste of priests of steam. These men breathed coal dust. They heard music in the hiss of venting steam. They sincerely, fanatically believed that humanity could not possibly invent anything better, more powerful, or more noble than the steam engine. This faith became their armor against doubt, but this same armor soon blinded them. Part 3. Greatness. By the beginning of the 20th century, the scale of Baldwin's production reached such limits that Philadelphia literally began to choke. The Broad Street plant was squeezed on all sides by city blocks. Locomotives had to be rolled out onto the streets right amid horse-drawn carriages and pedestrians, creating chaos. Land cost astronomical amounts of money. There was nowhere to expand. Leadership made a historic decision. They needed a new home. A home fit for kings. In 1906, the Great Exodus began. Baldwin began the gradual relocation of its entire colossal production southward to a suburb called Eddystone, located on the banks of the Delaware River. What they built there defies comprehension even by modern standards. It was an unprecedented infrastructure project. Imagine an area of 600 acres of continuous heavy industry. It was an industrial Olympus, a city of red brick, steel, and glass. Dozens of miles of their own intra-plant railroad tracks. Giant foundries where liquid metal flowed like a river around the clock. Forge shops with steam hammers the size of a 3-story building, the impacts of which made the ground tremble for miles around. The erecting shops were so huge that their own microclimate formed inside them. During World War I, the Eddystone complex worked to the bone, producing not only locomotives, but also artillery shells and rifles for the Army. The army of workers reached an incredible figure: 18,000 people. Eddystone became the heart of American heavy industry. In the 1920s, the company reached the absolute, undisputed peak of its greatness. This was the era of monsters. Baldwin began producing mallet-articulated locomotives, giant machines consisting of 2 sets of steam engines under one colossal boiler. They weighed hundreds of tons, devoured mountains of coal per hour, and could pull entire cities, endless trains of coal and ore, over the passes of the Rocky Mountains. When such a machine drove by, it felt like an earthquake was happening. The face and soul of this era was Samuel Vauquelin, the company president. He was a superstar of American business, a living legend. Vauquelin was a giant not only in title, but in character. He started as a simple inspector and became the absolute monarch of Eddystone. He ruled the plant with an iron fist, knew thousands of workers by name, and could walk up to a lathe himself and show how to properly turn a part. He flew to business meetings on Zeppelins. He dined with U.S. presidents and European monarchs. He signed multi-million-dollar contracts on napkins in restaurants with a single stroke of his pen. Vauquelin sincerely believed Baldwin was invincible. He looked out at his Eddystone plant from the roof of the administration building and saw an empire on which the sun never set. But it was at this moment of absolute dominance, when the registers were bursting with money and the order book was filled for years ahead, that a fatal psychological trap formed. Baldwin's leadership looked at the roar of massive fireboxes, at the plumes of black smoke blanketing the sky, at the sparks flying from under steel wheels as the only true embodiment of transport power. They fell in love with the aesthetics and physics of steam. They became poets of boiling water. Their corporate ego inflated to the same massive size as their locomotives. They believed they weren't just producing trains, they were commanding the laws of physics. And this arrogance blinded them. They stopped looking around. Part 4. Signals of Change. Blindness to diesel. In the 1930s, while Baldwin was basking in its greatness, a threat appeared on the horizon. And, most insultingly for proud railroad men, it came from a completely different industry, from a world they despised, from the automotive industry. The auto giant General Motors, led by the genius Alfred Sloan, was looking for new markets for expansion. In 1930, GM quietly bought a small, little-known company called Electromotive Corporation, EMC, and engine manufacturer Winton Engine Company. EMC didn't build steam locomotives. They experimented with a new, heretical concept: diesel-electric traction. The idea was elegant in its efficiency. A huge diesel internal combustion engine spun an electrical generator. The generator produced current that powered electric traction motors located right on the wheel axles. No boilers, no coal, no steam, no giant connecting rods. When rumors of these developments reached the offices in Eddystone, Samuel Vauclain and his engineers burst out laughing. To the old, hardened priests of steam, it sounded like a bad joke. How can a manufacturer of cheap little cars and trucks teach us how to pull 10,000-ton trains over mountains, they said. Baldwin made the classic textbook mistake of an absolute market leader. They ridiculed a disruptive innovation. Samuel Vauclain stated publicly in the press that diesel was just an expensive, finicky toy. Yes, perhaps it was suitable for light switching work in a depot, where you just needed to shunt cars around. Perhaps it would work for light, high-speed passenger trains, streamliners, where a clean exhaust was important. But for real work, Vauclain would say, slamming his fist on the table, for heavy mainline freight hauling, steam will remain king forever. No diesel will ever put out the starting tractive effort of a steam engine. They were certain they were right. But General Motors was playing a completely different game. Baldwin's engineers thought in terms of a custom boutique. Each of their steam locomotives was a work of art, built to order. And General Motors thought in terms of the assembly line. They developed standardized diesel locomotives, the famous E and F series. These locomotives were assembled from standard blocks, like a Lego set. If you needed more power, you simply coupled 2, 3, or 4 identical locomotives together, and they were controlled by a single engineer from the lead cab. For 2 steam locomotives, you needed 2 full crews of an engineer and a fireman, who had to coordinate actions with whistles. But GM's main weapon wasn't just technology, it was the business model. While Baldwin sent clients beautiful blueprints of new, even larger and more ravenous steam engines, GM's sales managers came to railroad executives with calculators. They offered stunning financial schemes. They gave guarantees of fuel savings. They showed that standardized spare parts, identical pistons, generators, relays, could be bought from a warehouse in one day, while repairing a unique Baldwin steam locomotive required custom casting of parts. Baldwin suffered from a severe case of marketing myopia, a term later coined by Theodore Levitt. The engineers in Eddystone firmly believed their business was producing steam locomotives. They didn't understand that railroads didn't need steam locomotives at all. They didn't need steam, coal, or beautiful smokestacks. Railroads needed cheap, reliable, predictable, and continuous traction to move freight from point A to point B. And diesel provided that traction cheaper. While Baldwin turned away and looked at a 19th century calendar, General Motors quietly began to conquer their empire. Part 5. The Fall, Panic and Bad Clones. Immediately after the end of World War II, the illusions shattered, and reality hit Eddystone hard in the face. Political and economic factors also played a role. Coal miners' unions, led by the tough John L. Lewis, launched constant, grueling strikes. The price of coal skyrocketed. Fuel supply disruptions became the norm. Railroad executives looked at their ledgers and were horrified. A huge fleet of steam locomotives was literally burning up their profits. At the same time, diesel proved its undeniable advantages. A diesel locomotive didn't require giant infrastructure. It didn't need water towers every 50 miles. It didn't need coal loading towers. It didn't need ash pit cleaning facilities. A diesel could run for days without stopping for service. It was clean. It didn't cover cities in soot. And most importantly, its smooth electric drive caused far less damage to steel rails, saving millions on track repair. A massive, rapid, and avalanching rejection of steam traction by American railroads began. Orders for steam locomotives simply vanished. They were gone. A real, undisguised panic began in the corridors of Baldwin Locomotive Works. They realized they had slept through the revolution. They desperately tried to jump on the departing train and feverishly began developing their own diesel locomotives. But here, their great century-old corporate culture, their pride, and their DNA played a cruel joke on them. Eddystone employed the world's best specialists in steam thermodynamics, boilers, and heavy metallurgy, but they knew nothing about the intricacies of high-revving diesels and complex power electronics. They started building diesels using the logic of steam locomotives. Instead of making a light, standardized machine, they made their firstborn diesels incredibly heavy, with massive cast frames, like steam locomotives. They continued their custom approach. Every new batch of Baldwin diesels differed from the previous one. Different wiring schematics, different component layouts. For mechanics in railroad depots, servicing Baldwin diesels turned into sheer hell. To fix a GM locomotive, a mechanic simply opened a standard manual. To fix a Baldwin locomotive, a mechanic had to solve a puzzle. Because the wires were routed differently every time, and the necessary, unique spare parts were never in stock. Furthermore, Baldwin's engines, de la Verne, often suffered from oil leaks and vibrations. They were temperamental. Baldwin's market share, which had once been absolute, plummeted into the abyss. General Motors, with their standardized workhorses of the F-Series, was simply sweeping competitors off the board. In a desperate attempt to survive, to find any resources and competencies, Baldwin's leadership decided to merge. In 1950, they merged with another sinking giant of the steam era, the Lima Hamilton Corporation. The new corporation was named Baldwin Lima Hamilton, BLH. But the math of business is ruthless. Combining two outsiders who arrived late to the technological party doesn't add up to a champion. It was like two drowning men in the ocean grabbing onto each other. They just go to the bottom faster. Together, they still couldn't beat the ruthless, efficient, standardized assembly line of General Motors. Part 6. The Crash. The End of History. By the early 1950s, the financial hemorrhage inside Baldwin Lima Hamilton had reached catastrophic proportions. The company was losing money on every locomotive produced. No marketing gimmicks or discounts could win back the trust of the railroads, which had already transitioned to GM and ALCO standards. There was another major player in this drama, the Westinghouse Electric Corporation. Westinghouse had historically been a partner to Baldwin. They supplied them with traction motors, generators, and all the complex electrical innards for their diesel-electric locomotives. Seeing that their main locomotive manufacturing partner was rapidly sinking and accumulating massive debts for supplied electrical equipment, Westinghouse management made a tough call. In 1951, Westinghouse essentially bought a controlling stake in Baldwin Lima Hamilton. Their goal was pragmatic. They were trying to save their investment, take control of management, and attempt to bring order to the chaos reigning in Eddystone. They hoped their expertise in electrical engineering could fix the flawed designs of BLH locomotives. But it was too late. The disease had gone too far. When financiers and auditors from Westinghouse entered the offices at Eddystone and looked at the balance sheet without historical sentimentality, the picture was frightening. Baldwin's share of the U.S. mainline locomotive market had fallen to the level of a statistical error. Competing with the monstrous efficiency, marketing power, and financial resources of General Motors wasn't just difficult, it was economically pointless. Baldwin's production lines were inefficient, and their products were too diverse and complex to assemble. Every attempt to develop a new competitive locomotive, like for example, experimental gas turbine electric locomotives, resulted in colossal losses and technological failures. In 1956, a cold, calculated, absolutely emotionless corporate decision was made. The Westinghouse Board of Directors ruled to completely, permanently cease locomotive production at the Baldwin plant. A decision that would have seemed like madness and sacrilege just 20 years prior was signed off by accountants in sterile offices, far from the smell of machine oil, coal, and red-hot steel. The fires in the furnaces were put out. The massive steam hammers stopped. The silence that hung over Eddystone was deafening. The workshops, within whose walls 70,000 machines had been built, went silent forever. The giant 600-acre plant in Eddystone, this industrial Olympus, began to be slowly, methodically carved into pieces. The company was repurposed to produce heavy construction equipment, turbines, and presses, but this was already the agony phase. Parts of the massive territory were sold to outside companies. The machines were cut up for scrap metal. Proud engineers, hereditary locomotive builders, were laid off. 125 years of uninterrupted, unconditional engineering glory, which began with a small jewelry shop in Philadelphia, ended in dust and oblivion. Part 7. Conclusion of the story. The story of the fall of Baldwin Locomotive Works is not just a sad historical sketch. It is a classic, brutal, and vivid textbook on business strategy. First, it is a lesson in how deadly dangerous it is to fall in love with your own product. Baldwin became a hostage to its own incredible craftsmanship. They were artists in the medium of metal. They learned to boil water bend steel, and control steam so masterfully that they forgot the primary fundamental task of any business: to solve their customers' problems in the cheapest and most efficient way. The customer needed to move freight, not admire the power of steam. Diesel was ugly. It didn't blow a romantic whistle. It smelled of fuel oil. But it solved the customer's problem better. Aesthetics lost to economics. Second, we see here the classic innovator's dilemma. Baldwin thought that if they controlled 80% of the market, if they had the best engineers and the biggest factories, they had the right to dictate technology to the market. They rested on their laurels. They failed to understand the main rule of technological revolutions. Disruptive innovation almost never comes from direct competitors. It came from a completely different industry, from car manufacturers. General Motors brought not just a different engine, it brought a different philosophy: mass assembly line production and standardization versus a custom boutique. By the time the giant realized the scale of the threat, its lumbering body was already covered in mortal wounds. And finally, the empty lots of Eddystone, where the wind now blows, remind us of the inexorability of progress. No historical greatness, no service to the nation during wars, no millions of dollars in the bank, and no century-long monopoly will save you if you refuse to admit that the rules of the game have changed. It is not the strongest or the oldest who survives. The one who survives is the one who knows how to adapt. Progress is ruthless. It does not respect gray hair, traditions, or a beautiful history. It respects only math, speed, and efficiency.